The Battle of the Atlantic, which raged from the very first day of the Second World War in September 1939 until the final defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945, was not merely a peripheral naval engagement. It was, by far, the longest and arguably the most strategically decisive campaign of the entire conflict. Unlike the dramatic, rapid, territorial conquest seen on the European mainland, this was a protracted, brutal war of logistics and endurance, for across the immense, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the fundamental premise of the campaign was simple, yet absolutely existential. If the German forces could successfully sever the maritime supply lines linking North America to Great Britain, the island nation would be starved into submission and completely forced out of the war, making any subsequent Allied landing in Europe utterly impossible. The Battle of the Atlantic, in the words of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, was the fight upon which everything turned. The United Kingdom, the primary target of this oceanic strangulation, was an island nation whose survival depended entirely on the uninterrupted flow of goods. By 1940, Britain was almost entirely isolated, standing as the last remaining democratic bastion against the tide of totalitarian conquest in Western Europe. To survive, its population and its war machine required massive, continuous imports of essential resources from the empire and, crucially, from the burgeoning industrial might of the United States. These vital imports included approximately 25 million tons of materials annually, comprising nearly 70% of the nation's food supply, all its oil and fuel, and the vast quantities of raw materials and finished weapons systems necessary to sustain its armed forces and domestic industrial capacity. The moment this flow of life-giving supplies was effectively cut off, Britain's ability to wage war would collapse within weeks, rendering the victories in the Battle of Britain and the resistance on the Eastern Front ultimately irrelevant to the Reich's final victory. Conversely, the German strategy, directed primarily by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the German submarine fleet, was ruthlessly focused on a singular, strategic objective: tonnage warfare. Dönitz correctly recognized that the only way to defeat the immense industrial power of the Allies was not through a single, decisive naval battle against the powerful British home fleet, but through a slow, systematic destruction of the civilian merchant shipping that sustained the British economy. The goal was to sink merchant ships faster than the British and Americans could build new ones, forcing the economic collapse of the Allied war effort. The primary weapon deployed to achieve this strategic goal was the undersea boot, or U-boat, the German submarine. These boats, operating in coordinated groups, offered the perfect vehicle for striking at the vulnerable, unescorted merchant shipping in the vast spaces of the mid-Atlantic where air cover could not reach. The opening phase of the campaign, which extended through 1940 and into 1941, proved devastating for the Allies. The fall of France in June 1940 dramatically shifted the balance of power, granting the German submarine fleet immediate access to the superior French Atlantic coastal ports such as Brest, Lorient, and La Pallice. This strategic gift vastly improved the operational reach of the German U-boats, allowing them to bypass the narrow, heavily patrolled waters of the English Channel and the North Sea. Consequently, the U-boats were able to operate much further out into the Atlantic, targeting convoys at points where the Royal Navy's limited escort vessels and short-range aircraft could not provide continuous, adequate protection. This period became infamously known among German submariners as the First Happy Time, a dark period where skilled German U-boat captains, coordinating their devastating Wolf-Pack attacks, sank merchant ships almost at will, causing immense, unsustainable losses to the Allied merchant fleet and bringing Britain to the very brink of strategic exhaustion. The sheer, terrifying efficiency of the German U-boat offensive during this time underscored the existential threat facing the Allies and highlighted the immense technological, tactical, and industrial effort that would be required to finally secure the critical Atlantic lifeline. The devastating impact of the U-boat offensive during the early phase of the war rapidly forced the Allied powers, principally Great Britain and later the United States and Canada, to revert to an ancient but highly effective naval strategy, which was the convoy system. The fundamental logic of the convoy was one of concentration and mutual defense. Instead of allowing hundreds of vulnerable merchant ships to sail independently across the vast ocean, where they could be easily singled out and destroyed by a single U-boat, these ships were gathered into tightly packed groups, with some convoys containing as many as 60 to 70 vessels, and protected by a small, dedicated escort of warships. This system fundamentally transformed the strategic calculation for the German U-boats, shifting the conflict from a one-sided hunt against isolated prey to a direct, violent tactical confrontation with armed naval vessels. The organization of a transatlantic convoy was a colossal logistical undertaking, orchestrated by the Admiralty in London and the naval commands in Halifax, Canada, and later in various ports across the eastern seaboard of the United States. Convoys were typically designated by a code based on their destination and moved at the speed of the slowest vessel, often creeping across the ocean at a meager 7 or 8 knots. The ships sailed in tight columns, creating a large, but consolidated, target box. The strategic concept was that the presence of even a few destroyers, frigates, or corvettes small, nimble, anti-submarine warships could deter a U-boat attack or, at the very least, force the submarine to remain submerged and immobile, losing its strategic advantage of speed and stealth. The escort vessels, equipped with basic detection gear like ASDIC, the early form of sonar, and armed with depth charges, constantly patrolled the perimeter, prepared to sacrifice themselves to protect the invaluable merchant cargo. The sheer discipline required by dozens of civilian merchant captains to maintain formation, often in terrible North Atlantic weather, navigating by basic instruments and relying entirely on the protection of their naval guards, was one of the unsung heroic chapters of the entire war. The German Naval Command, under the brilliant and ruthless leadership of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, quickly recognized that the traditional, solitary U-boat attack was rendered inefficient by the convoy system. Dönitz's immediate strategic countermeasure was the development of the revolutionary Wolfpack strategy, a coordinated attack force that transformed submarine warfare. This tactic relied on combining the individual striking power of multiple U-boats into a concentrated, overwhelming force designed to saturate the convoy's defenses. The Wolfpack operation was executed in distinct phases. A single scouting U-boat would locate a convoy, typically on the surface, where it could achieve maximum speed and utilize radio communication. It would then trail the convoy, maintaining contact while vectoring other boats to the target area, using sophisticated, encrypted radio signals. Dönitz's central command would direct as many as 6 to 20 U-boats to converge on the convoy's position. Crucially, the attack was almost always timed to begin at night, when the U-boats were virtually invisible against the dark, stormy surface, and the Allied escort vessels could not effectively use their early sonar detection equipment to acoustic interference from the waves. The coordinated assault would occur primarily on the surface, where U-boats were faster than the convoy and many of the escorts, and generally from multiple directions simultaneously. The U-boats would breach the convoy perimeter, firing torpedoes from close range, often at multiple targets, and then swiftly escaping on the surface before the confused escorts could pinpoint their location. This created a strategic nightmare for the escorts, forcing them to choose between pursuing a submarine, which would take them away from the main body of the convoy, or remaining close to the merchant ships, which would leave the U-boats free to fire again. The early success of the Wolfpacks, particularly in 1941 and 1942, was amplified by a critical technological imbalance. The Allied forces often suffered from the critical inability to break the sophisticated German cipher codes transmitted via the Enigma machine, providing Dönitz with near-perfect operational security. This allowed the German command to direct its Wolfpacks precisely to the vast air gap in the mid-Atlantic, the critical zone where Allied land-based aircraft could not provide continuous, essential coverage. This communication superiority was a strategic multiplier, transforming the submarine fleet from scattered raiders into a coordinated, deadly strategic weapon. The Allied escort forces, often limited to slow corvettes and aging destroyers, were frequently overwhelmed by the sheer number of simultaneous torpedo attacks, resulting in the sinking of vast amounts of desperately needed tonnage and escalating the campaign into its most crisis-ridden and dangerous period for Britain. The period spanning late 1940 through much of 1941, and then dramatically reigniting after the United States entered the war, was marked by two phases known in the German submarine fleet as the first happy time and the second happy time, reflecting the catastrophic efficiency of U-boat operations against Allied shipping. During these periods, German submarines operated with near total impunity, hunting vulnerable or poorly defended merchant vessels, particularly after Germany gained access to vital Atlantic bases on the coast of occupied France. These advanced bases allowed the submarines to reach far more distant convoy routes. The strategic disaster for the Allies intensified during the spring of 1941, when shipping losses far outstripped any attempts by Great Britain and its allies to compensate for them through new construction. This crisis forced Winston Churchill to publicly state that everything hinged upon the Battle of the Atlantic, as without the necessary supply lifeline, the war on land would become unsustainable. This initial crisis was temporarily relieved in mid-1941 when British technological successes, specifically the advancements in breaking German code messages transmitted via the Enigma machine, allowed the Admiralty to better route convoys away from known U-boat patrol lines, leading to a crucial, temporary drop in German effectiveness. However, the true period of apocalypse for the Allies arrived after December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany immediately declared war on the United States. This declaration instantly opened up new, incredibly vulnerable hunting grounds for the German submarines, the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. Following America's entry into the conflict, the devastating phase known as the Second Happy Time began, made possible by the severe, inexplicable unpreparedness of the U.S. Navy for the demands of anti-submarine warfare. American naval operations, still operating under a peacetime mindset, lacked any organized convoy system and, critically, failed to implement even basic blackout procedures for cities along the coast, attempting instead to maintain a facade of normality and protect tourism. The result of this negligence was a massacre at sea. German U-boats could easily identify and target merchant ships, whose dark silhouettes were perfectly illuminated by the bright, peacetime lights of coastal cities, appearing like targets against a brightly lit Christmas tree. Ships loaded with essential resources for Britain and vital war materials for domestic production were sunk literally within sight of the civilian population, creating a psychological shock across the nation. In the period from January to July 1942, German submarines achieved unprecedented success, sinking hundreds of ships along the American coast, in the Gulf of Mexico, and throughout the Caribbean Sea. Experienced U-boat crews felt completely secure, as the threat from the U.S. Navy was minimal. Patrols were rare. Early sonar detectors were often malfunctioning or improperly utilized, and essential coordination between the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the Air Force was virtually non-existent. This was a dark period where German submarines were able to approach American ports to shell oil storage facilities and even land agents for sabotage missions, underscoring Germany's almost complete dominance over the Atlantic sea lanes. Only the insistent, desperate demands from the British Admiralty and the mounting political outcry from the American government finally forced the U.S. command to abandon its rigid, dogmatic reluctance to implement the convoy system, which they had initially deemed inefficient, with massive, critical delays. The American Navy finally instituted organized convoys and enforced mandatory coastal blackouts in mid-1942. These belated but decisive measures slowly, but inexorably, forced the German submarines to retreat from the relative safety of the coast and return to the only remaining unprotected area on the vital shipping route, the Mid-Atlantic Gap, where the battle would reach its true, bloody culmination. Thus, despite the potential of infinite resources brought by the United States entry, the initial consequence was a deeper, more dangerous crisis at sea. By mid-1942, the belated but decisive implementation of the convoy system and coastal blackouts by the United States had successfully curtailed the devastating losses experienced during the second happy time off the American seaboard. Forced to retreat from the relative safety of the coastlines, the German submarine fleet, under the determined leadership of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, directed its focus back to the deep, hostile waters of the open ocean. Their primary target became the Mid-Atlantic Gap, a massive, strategic vacuum that represented the single greatest vulnerability of the entire transatlantic supply route. The Mid-Atlantic Gap was an immense, rectangular swath of open ocean, roughly 1,000 miles wide, situated in the central North Atlantic. This zone lay entirely beyond the effective operational range of the anti-submarine aircraft flying from either the North American or the British bases. Escort carriers, small, vital ships that carried aircraft, were still too few in number to provide consistent aerial coverage, and the range of land-based planes, despite utilizing advanced technology, simply failed to bridge this immense chasm. For the German submarine command, this gap was a tactical sanctuary. It was the only place where the deadly Wolfpack tactic could operate with relative impunity. Free from the continuous aerial vigilance that had begun to neutralize their effectiveness near the coast, Dönitz correctly concentrated his greatest strength here, knowing that this gap was the inevitable killing ground where the fate of the convoy lifeline would ultimately be decided. The crisis came to a head during the brutal winter and spring months of 1943. This period marked the absolute, terrifying climax of the Battle of the Atlantic. The number of U-boats operational in the North Atlantic reached its peak, with Dönitz often deploying over 100 vessels simultaneously. The Wolfpacks were now operating in massive groups, sometimes comprising 20 to 30 submarines, relentlessly targeting the convoys that were forced to traverse the unprotected gap. The resulting battles were nightmarish struggles of endurance and survival. In March 1943, the German submarine fleet achieved its most devastating success of the entire war. The concurrent battles fought against two major Allied convoys, Convoy SC-122 and Convoy HX-229, resulted in the catastrophic loss of 21 merchant ships within just a few days, an unimaginable amount of critical tonnage. The losses were so profound, and the success of the Wolfpack tactics so overwhelming, that the British Admiralty issued secret, highly alarming internal warnings, stating that the Allies were potentially losing the war in the Atlantic, and that the survival of Britain was once again gravely threatened. The primary reason for this catastrophic crisis was the continued technological asymmetry in the Mid-Atlantic. The Allies' attempts to provide escort were hampered by the lack of sufficient long-range patrol aircraft capable of operating effectively in the gap. The U-boats, operating on the surface at night, were nearly invisible, striking with devastating stealth. Furthermore, the German intelligence apparatus, still managing to read portions of the Allied convoy codes, often had prior knowledge of the convoy's routes and defenses, allowing Dönitz to position his Wolfpacks with surgical, fatal precision. The human cost was immense, with thousands of merchant sailors and naval escorts losing their lives in the frigid waters, often having to abandon their burning vessels far from any hope of rescue. The crisis of early 1943 demanded an immediate, radical, and overwhelming response from the combined Allied powers. The British and American commands recognized that the fate of the war hinged entirely on their ability to close the Mid-Atlantic Gap and neutralize the Wolfpack threat. The solution required a massive commitment of resources and the rapid integration of critical new technologies and strategic concepts. The focus shifted entirely to mass production, advanced detection, and strategic coordination, setting the stage for the pivotal counteroffensive that would ultimately decide the longest campaign of the entire war. The catastrophic losses suffered by the Allies in March 1943, when German Wolfpacks reached their peak effectiveness, forced the naval commands into an immediate, radical strategic overhaul. The continuation of the war without guaranteed transatlantic supply lines was utterly impossible. The result of this crisis was the definitive turning point in the campaign, a shift that occurred with remarkable speed in May 1943. A month widely regarded as the moment the Battle of the Atlantic was finally won by the Allies. This victory was secured not by a single factor, but through the perfectly synchronized application of three crucial elements: technological superiority, tactical innovation, and, most critically, the resolute closure of the mid-Atlantic gap. One of the most important technological innovations to completely change the dynamic of the war was the massive deployment of very long-range VL aircraft, specifically the modified consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber. These aircraft, equipped with auxiliary fuel tanks for extended operations, finally possessed the necessary range to provide continuous aerial coverage over the very mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats had previously operated with total impunity. The presence of these aircraft became an absolute nightmare for the German submarine fleet. U-boats were most effective on the surface, where they could achieve high speeds and coordinate their packs, but they were utterly vulnerable from the air. The aircraft forced the U-boats to submerge and remain underwater, which drastically reduced their speed, consumed precious battery power and fuel, and, most importantly, made it impossible for them to use their radios to coordinate the devastating Wolfpack attacks. Every flight of AVL craft over the gap effectively shattered the core offensive tactic developed by Admiral Dönitz. A critical secondary technological advantage was the rapid deployment of new, highly sensitive radar equipment, specifically the widespread use of centimetric radar utilizing a much shorter wavelength than previous versions allowed Allied escort vessels and aircraft to detect the surface U-boats at night and in poor weather conditions. Unlike older radar, centimetric radar was largely undetectable by the U-boat's existing passive warning receivers, making the submarine commanders believe they were approaching a convoy undetected when, in fact, they were fully visible to the Allied air crews. This technological surprise was devastating. U-boats were frequently caught on the surface by aircraft equipped with centimetric radar and quickly destroyed before they could crash dive, effectively eliminating the tactical advantage of nocturnal surface attack that the Wolfpacks relied upon. Tactical innovation within the escort groups was equally vital. The Allies introduced the concept of the support group, independent teams of small escort warships, frigates, and corvettes that were not formally tied to a specific convoy. Their mission was purely offensive. Once a U-boat attack was confirmed against a convoy, the support group would race to the scene and hunt the attacking U-boats relentlessly for days, preventing them from escaping and rejoining another pack. This aggressive counter-hunting tactic drastically increased the risk for the German submarine crews and transformed the U-boat's hunting ground into a death trap. Furthermore, the mass deployment of escort carriers, small, converted aircraft carriers that could provide air cover directly within the convoy, further closed the remaining open patches of the gap. The results of this synchronized Allied counteroffensive were immediate and dramatic. In May 1943, U-boat losses soared to unsustainable levels, reaching a staggering 43 submarines sunk in that single month alone. This loss rate, which accounted for nearly a quarter of the entire operational German submarine fleet, was catastrophic for the German command. Grand Admiral Dönitz, faced with the stark reality that he was losing his most experienced crews and most valuable assets, was forced to make the agonizing and desperate decision to temporarily withdraw the bulk of his U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic trade routes. The strategic objective of sinking Allied supply lines was abandoned. The convoy routes were cleared, the supply lifeline to Britain was secured, and the immense flow of resources necessary for the planned invasions of Italy and France was finally guaranteed. May 1943 became the decisive victory for the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic, ensuring that Hitler would not win the war through economic strangulation. The pivotal Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic during 1943 was not secured through bravery and persistence alone. It was, fundamentally, a triumph of technology and applied science. Recognizing that the numerical superiority of the German submarines could only be countered by blinding the enemy and giving the escorts a decisive edge in detection and attack, the Allies initiated a rapid, intensive program of technological warfare. This commitment to innovation proved to be the core factor in permanently turning the tide against the Wolfpacks. The most critical advancement came in the field of detection. For years, the German submarines had enjoyed nearly perfect invisibility when operating on the surface at night, which was the preferred time for their coordinated attacks. The Allied solution was the massive deployment of centimetric radar operating at a 10-centimeter wavelength. Unlike the older, longer wavelength radar systems, this new technology was immensely precise and, crucially, undetectable by the U-boat's existing passive warning receivers. German commanders were operating under the false, fatal assumption that their equipment provided complete warning against aerial attack. The new radar allowed Allied aircraft and escort ships to spot the surfaced U-boats at night and in heavy fog precisely the conditions under which the Wolfpacks were most effective, and catch them completely unawares before they could submerge. The introduction of centimetric radar effectively eliminated the tactical advantage of nocturnal surface attack, forcing the U-boats to remain submerged and slowing their operational tempo to a crawl. Equally vital to the surface escorts was the continuous improvement of sonar sound navigation and ranging technology. Early sonar systems, known as ASDIC, were effective but often struggled with acoustic interference from high waves and ship noises, making them unreliable in rough seas common conditions in the North Atlantic. Allied scientists rapidly developed directional sonar, improving the precision and depth-finding capabilities of the equipment. Furthermore, the Allies deployed the Hedgehog, a revolutionary anti-submarine mortar. Previously, depth charges had to be dropped after the attacking ship passed over the submarine, momentarily losing sonar contact and allowing the submarine time to evade. The Hedgehog fired a pattern of small contact-fused bombs forward of the escort, exploding only upon direct impact. This allowed the escort to maintain continuous sonar contact with the submerged submarine right up to the moment of attack, dramatically increasing the lethality and effectiveness of the attack and instilling greater fear and caution in German submarine crews. The war for information proved to be the most decisive factor of all. The secret work conducted at Bletchley Park in Great Britain, where brilliant cryptologists worked tirelessly to break the codes generated by the German Enigma machine, provided the Allies with an unparalleled strategic advantage. By early 1943, Allied intelligence had achieved consistent success in reading the German naval codes, providing them with near real-time knowledge of the enemy's operational plans. This intelligence, known as Ultra, was not merely confirmation of activity. It was prescient knowledge. It allowed the Admiralty to read Grand Admiral Dinitz's instructions to his U-boat commanders, knowing precisely where the Wolfpacks were congregating, their assigned routes, and the exact position of the deadly mid-Atlantic gap. This intelligence enabled the British command to successfully reroute slow, vulnerable convoys around the vast, concentrated submarine traps and simultaneously direct fast, powerful support groups of escort ships directly onto the U-boat patrol lines, transforming the hunters into the hunted. The ability to read the enemy's mind neutralized the entire tactical advantage of the German submarine strategy and was, perhaps, the single greatest contributor to the victory. The final technological component was the mass production and deployment of new, long-range air platforms. The expanded deployment of very long-range VLR aircraft, capable of sustained patrols across the mid-Atlantic gap, combined with the new centimetric radar, ensured that the German submarines no longer had a sanctuary. The VLR aircraft, forcing the U-boats to remain submerged and slow, effectively sealed the gap, making coordinated attacks nearly impossible and massively increasing the risks for German crews. The combination of these synchronized technological advances, undetectable radar, forward-firing weapons, and code-breaking intelligence overwhelmed the German U-boat fleet and secured the Atlantic lifeline for good. The synchronized application of new technology, specifically The undetectable centimetric radar and immensely improved sonar was immediately coupled with a fundamental and necessary aggressive shift in Allied naval tactics, the sober realization that merely defending convoys was insufficient to break the back of the German submarine campaign prompted the Allied High Command to transition decisively to an offensive strategy, aiming not just to repel the attacks, but to actively seek out, hunt down, and permanently destroy the German submarine fleet across the wide expanse of the Atlantic. This profound change in doctrine was physically embodied by the immediate creation and rapid deployment of the support groups. Prior to 1943, escort warships were rigidly attached to specific convoys. Their primary, non-negotiable mission was strictly defensive, protect the valuable merchant ships at all costs, even if it meant breaking off pursuit of a submarine that had already attacked. This defensive mandate inadvertently created a secure operational environment for the German Wolfpacks. A U-boat could attack a convoy, safely submerge, escape relatively unharmed, and then quickly rejoin a pack to attack a different convoy. Knowing the escorts would never leave the merchant ships to chase them down, the escorts were tactically constrained by their primary duty. The revolutionary concept of the support group eliminated this critical operational restriction. These newly formed groups were composed of 6 to 8 small, but heavily armed escort warships, typically frigates and corvettes, that were not assigned to a particular convoy. Instead, they operated entirely independently, positioned strategically around the mid-Atlantic area where U-boat activity was highest. Their mission was purely offensive. Once a U-boat attack was confirmed, or if intelligence indicated a significant Wolfpack concentration, the support group would race at top speed to the scene and engage the enemy. They were granted full autonomy to hunt a detected submarine for hours or even days, pursuing it relentlessly until it was either destroyed or forced permanently out of the operational area. This tactic fundamentally transformed the U-boat's hunting ground from a safe haven into a relentless, dangerous gauntlet, effectively ensuring that the hunter now became the hunted. The most famous and successful of these units was Support Group 2, commanded by the highly aggressive Captain Frederick Johnny Walker. Walker's groups quickly perfected the new anti-submarine tactics, utilizing the improved sonar and radio communication from ultra-intelligence to conduct systematic, prolonged sweeps. Walker's relentless, calculated aggression, often staying on the submerged trail of a submarine for over 36 hours, became legendary and inflicted catastrophic losses on the German fleet, validating the tactical shift from pure defense to aggressive offense. This new, aggressive strategy required equally effective, specialized offensive weaponry. The Allies began the mass deployment of two key innovations that fundamentally changed the close-quarters submarine hunt. The first was the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar. Previously, the primary anti-submarine weapon was the depth charge, which had to be dropped directly after the attacking ship passed over the submarine, momentarily losing sonar contact and giving the submarine time to evade. The Hedgehog, conversely, fired a pattern of up to 24 small, contact-fused bombs that exploded only upon direct impact, launching them forward of the ship. This technological leap allowed the escort vessel to maintain continuous sonar contact with the submerged submarine right up to the moment of the strike, dramatically increasing the lethality and effectiveness of the attack. The second key shift was the integration of escort carriers. These small, converted aircraft carriers, often operating directly within the convoy column or with the support groups, provided immediate, crucial aerial coverage. An aircraft could spot a surface submarine far faster than a ship's radar, forcing the U-boat to submerge and significantly hindering its ability to mount a coordinated attack. The combination of the persistent air threat, the highly lethal Hedgehog, and the aggressive support groups proved to be an overwhelming tactical combination that the German command simply could not overcome, leading directly to the immense victory of May 1943. The synchronized application of new technology, aggressive tactical shifts, and superior intelligence, specifically the continuous flow of information from the code breakers converged in the spring of 1943 to create a sudden, devastating reversal of fortune for the German submarine fleet. This period, culminating in the single month of May, became known to the Allies as the definitive victory and to the Germans as Black May, marking the irrefutable strategic turning point of the entire Atlantic campaign. The intense struggle of March 1943 had been the climax, but the brutal, decisive counteroffensive in May delivered the knockout blow. The crisis for the German forces began to accelerate in April, but reached a devastating peak in May. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the determined commander of the German submarine fleet, continued to deploy his Wolfpacks aggressively into the mid-Atlantic gap, unaware that his tactical doctrine was now perfectly countered by Allied technology and strategy. The German submarines were now sailing into a kill zone. The new centimetric radar, undetectable by the German warning receivers, allowed Allied long-range aircraft to spot the surface submarines at night and in fog, stripping the U-boats of their crucial stealth advantage. Furthermore, the relentless, aggressive pursuit tactics of the Allied support groups, led by figures like Captain Walker, ensured that once a submarine was found, it was hunted until destroyed or forced into complete exhaustion. The losses inflicted upon the German submarine fleet during this single, catastrophic month were unprecedented and unsustainable. In May 1943, the German forces lost a staggering 43 submarines sunk due to Allied actions. This catastrophic rate of loss accounted for nearly a quarter of the entire operational German submarine fleet and, more importantly, eliminated a massive number of highly trained, irreplaceable crews. The human cost and the loss of expertise were devastating. Replacing the highly skilled captains and officers took years, not months. The success of the Wolfpack was entirely reliant on the experienced leadership and coordination, and the losses of Black May effectively decapitated the fleet's tactical effectiveness. The profound military shock was exacerbated by the strategic reality. While German losses soared, the Allied convoy losses plummeted. The combination of full aerial coverage over the mid-Atlantic gap, the surgical routing of convoys around known danger zones thanks to code-breaking intelligence, and the aggressive hunting by the support groups meant that the supply lifeline to Great Britain was finally and permanently secured. The Allies were now sinking submarines far faster than the German shipyards could build them, and the vast tonnage of supplies reaching Britain was overwhelming the sinking rate. The goal of tonnage warfare, which Dönitz had championed, had been utterly inverted and achieved by the Allies. Faced with this irrefutable evidence of a strategic collapse, the loss rate being completely unsustainable and the intelligence clearly indicating an overwhelming Allied advantage, Grand Admiral Dönitz was forced to make the most agonizing decision of his naval career. On May 24, 1943, he ordered the temporary withdrawal of the bulk of his U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic trade routes. This withdrawal was a clear, tactical admission of defeat in the central theater of the campaign. The massive, strategic objective of starving Britain into submission had failed. The victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was secured for the Allies, guaranteeing the essential, continuous flow of resources, men, and material that would be absolutely critical for the success of the planned land invasions of Italy and, ultimately, Normandy. The long, brutal campaign was not fully over, as German submarines would continue to fight in smaller, less effective ways, but the decisive, strategic moment had passed. Following the devastating strategic defeat in Black May 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz and the German Naval High Command were forced to confront the harsh reality. Their existing U-boat fleet, reliant on surface operation for speed and coordination, was obsolete against the combined might of Allied radar and air cover. The temporary withdrawal of the U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic was immediately followed by a desperate and intense internal effort to develop revolutionary technologies that could counter the devastating Allied advantages and allow the submarines to safely return to their hunting grounds. The primary objective became achieving true submarine capability, a boat that could operate almost entirely submerged, removing the vulnerability that the Allies had so successfully exploited. The most immediate and critical invention born from this period of German desperation was the snorkel. This seemingly simple device was a collapsible pipe system that allowed the diesel engines of the U-boat to draw fresh air from the surface and exhaust gases back out while the submarine remained submerged at periscope depth, typically around 15 meters. Previously, the U-boats were forced to surface completely to recharge their batteries and replenish their air, which exposed them directly to centimetric radar and long-range aircraft. The snorkel provided a revolutionary solution, allowing the submarines to run their powerful diesel engines, which were necessary for high-speed evasion and rapid battery charging, without ever having to expose the vulnerable hull above the water. While the device was not perfect, it drastically reduced the boat's speed. The air intake could suddenly close in heavy seas, causing the diesel engines to suck the air out of the boat, and the system still presented a small radar signature. It represented a massive leap in survivability and allowed the German fleet to attempt to return to the Atlantic in 1944. Concurrently, the German Navy threw massive resources into the development and mass production of the so-called electroboats, the revolutionary new Type 21 U-boat. This was arguably the most advanced submarine design of the entire war and, if introduced earlier, might genuinely have altered the course of the Atlantic campaign. The Type 21 U-boat was a massive, streamlined design specifically built for sustained submerged operation. It featured an unprecedented battery capacity, offering submerged speeds of up to 17 knots a speed faster than many Allied escort ships at the time, which allowed it to outrun and evade pursuit while remaining completely underwater. It was also equipped with an automated torpedo reloading system, allowing it to fire a full salvo of 6 torpedoes in less than 3 minutes, a devastating improvement over previous models. The Type 21 completely negated the established Allied anti-submarine tactics, which relied on the assumption that a submerged U-boat was slow, blind, and could eventually be hunted down by fast surface ships. However, these revolutionary technological efforts were doomed by the massive industrial collapse of Nazi Germany under relentless Allied strategic bombing and the enormous delays in production caused by the war economy. The snorkel became commonplace, but primarily on older, less capable U-boats. As for the Type 21, while thousands were ordered, the first operational boat only entered service in the final weeks of the war in 1945. Too late to have any meaningful impact on the outcome of the campaign. The final phase of the Battle of the Atlantic, from late 1943 to 1945, saw German submarines equipped with snorkels attempting to return to the profitable coastal waters of Britain and North America. While they succeeded in sinking significant numbers of ships, the strategic situation was irreversibly fixed. Allied industrial production of new merchant ships and escort vessels now vastly outpaced the U-boat's ability to sink them, and the Allied forces maintained a crushing technological and intelligence superiority. The war for the Atlantic had been fundamentally lost by May 1943. The later technological innovation represented a heroic, desperate, but ultimately futile effort to reclaim the initiative. The definitive Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, secured by the decisive events of May 1943, represented an achievement of monumental strategic importance that extended far beyond the confines of the ocean itself. This campaign, which lasted the entire duration of the Second World War, was rightly considered by Allied leaders to be the linchpin of the entire conflict. The successful securing of the sea lanes guaranteed that the massive material and manpower resources of the North American continent could be safely transported to Great Britain, effectively transforming the island nation into the indispensable unsinkable aircraft carrier from which the eventual liberation of Europe would be launched. Without this victory, the subsequent invasions of North Africa, Italy, and, most critically, Normandy Operation Overlord, would have been logistically impossible. The immediate, critical consequence of the Allied victory was the guarantee of logistical supremacy. By late 1943, the Allies were producing new merchant ships and naval escort vessels at a rate that vastly outpaced the diminished German submarine fleet's ability to sink them. The focus of the Allied shipbuilding effort shifted from merely replacing losses to building up the immense armada necessary for the coming land offensives. This guaranteed flow of material meant that the massive forces of the United States, including tanks, aircraft, fuel, and supplies, could be stockpiled in Britain, preparing for the inevitable cross-channel invasion. The failure of the German submarine fleet to achieve its goal of tonnage warfare ensured that Germany would be defeated not just tactically, but strategically, by the sheer weight of Allied industrial might. The campaign left an indelible mark on naval warfare and technology. The continuous, desperate technological arms race for between the submarines and the escorts led to crucial advancements that defined post-war military technology. The necessity of countering the submarine threat accelerated the development and mass production of radar, sonar, and highly specialized anti-submarine aircraft. The ability to break the German Enigma codes, providing the invaluable ultra-intelligence, cemented the importance of signals intelligence in modern warfare and became the silent, decisive force multiplier for the Allied victory. While the Germans introduced radical designs, like the Type 21 submarine with the schnorkel and high underwater speed, design that pointed directly toward the future of naval technology, these innovations arrived too late to reverse the strategic defeat already suffered. The human cost of the campaign was immense and often overlooked in the shadows of the massive land battles of the Eastern Front. Thousands of Allied merchant sailors, civilian crews operating unarmed or lightly armed cargo vessels lost their lives, making the merchant service one of the most dangerous occupations of the war. They sailed continuously through the constant danger of torpedoes, depth charges, and freezing North Atlantic waters. Furthermore, the German submarine fleet suffered a catastrophic, debilitating loss rate. Approximately 75% of all U-boat crews, around 30,000 men, were killed in action, the highest casualty rate of any service branch in the German military. This human cost underscored the brutality and final desperation of the German struggle to sever the lifeline. In conclusion, the Battle of the Atlantic was a war fought for the strategic space necessary to wage the European war. The victory secured by the Allies in the pivotal months of 1943 ensured that the logistical foundation for the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany was firmly in place. It transformed the isolated defense of Britain into the springboard for the Allied return to the continent, guaranteeing that the military and industrial might of the United States would be brought to bear directly upon the European theater. The final outcome demonstrated that in a global conflict of total war, controlling the sea lanes and logistics is the ultimate prerequisite for victory.